Hey guys, so the reason you don't get to see my face for this video is because it's much easier to read a fanfiction from the computer than it is to print it off and record yourself reading it. Plus you get to enjoy some lovely fan art I found off the internet. I've given credit to the artist below, so you could go find some of their other work. But now I'm going to be reading Mistake, a Transformers fanfiction, part 1, because it is 21 chapters long. Chapters 1 through 4. Optimus entered his quarters and took off his armor, leaving only his groin covering on. He placed them on his desk and laid on his berth. Looking up at him at the ceiling, he sighed. He was so exhausted, yet his body wasn't allowing him to enter stasis. He just continued to stare at the ceiling, remembering the time before the war, the peace and prosperity, the love that he no longer felt. He sighed again and turned off his optics, hoping that would help him fall into stasis. The space bridge opened again, allowing RC and Bumblebee into the base. RC sighed inwardly, exhausted from patrol as well as not being able to rest for the last few solar cycles. She tried to maintain a constant smile, not wanting the others to know about her situation, but after a few days it was growing harder and harder to act like everything was okay. He had asked her several times today, but she had just brightened her tone and denied that anything was wrong. RC, I'd like to speak with you in the medical bay, said Ratchet, walking towards her. She sighed, but nodded, too exhausted to put up a real fight. She followed him to the medical bay and sat down on the medical berth, tiredly. What is it, Doc? She said, trying her best not to sound exhausted. You can cut the crap, RC. I know you're exhausted. Her optics winded a bit, wondering how he knew. Well, he was a medic. She sighed and looked at him. So, as a doctor, it is my duty to try and help my patients. You're not the only one with insomnia, you know. She raised an optic ridge to that. Insomnia? I was never diagnosed with insomnia. Well, I'm diagnosing you now, he replied curtly. Is there a medicine of some sort that will help me rest then? She asked, a bit too hopefully. He shook his head. No, not exactly. She looked at him confused. Not exactly? Then there's something? He nodded. Yes, but I don't exactly know what you'll think of it. She was even more confused by his tone. What was he talking about? Well, he cleared his throat. Well, as I've said before, you're not the only one here that suffers from insomnia. Optimus does as well. Yeah? So? Well, some mechs and femmes find ways to relax themselves so they can go into stasis. She wasn't sure she liked where this was going. So, you're suggesting that Optimus and I relax together? He chuckled softly. Darcy, I'm pretty sure you know where this is going. He's a mech, you're a femme. I know you're attracted to each other, so why not? She could feel the energon race to her cheeks. Are you suggesting I interface with Optimus? He couldn't help but laugh. Come on, RC. It's not as though you two aren't attracted to one another. I know you're attracted to him, and he's attracted to you. And there is no harm in a little interfacing. She was blushing profusely now. I couldn't do that. For one, the other's my ear, and two, what if he doesn't want me? I'd be mortified. Optimus has wanted you for some time now, trust me. As for the others, I'll send them out on missions. And what of you? He laughed. RC, I've heard Optimus and Birth with a femme before. More than once, actually. We did roommate together when we were younger. She was flustered, but nodded. Yeah, fine, whatever. Just don't walk in on us, and don't you dare tell the others. He laughed and nodded. He's in his quarters. I'll get rid of the others, he said, leaving her seated on the medical berth as he walked out. She stood where she was for a few moments and then got up, calming herself. She was going to be in the same berth as Optimus Prime. She walked toward his quarters. Sure, she was excited, but mostly worried. What if he refused her? What if he didn't want her? She stood outside his quarters, looking at the door knob. She shook her helm. You're a warrior. Warriors aren't afraid. She turned the knob, stepping inside. Optimus sat up, his optics coming online. She sighed deeply, locking the door, but staying where she was. Then she focused her optics on Optimus. RC? Optimus asked, looking at the small femme standing by his door. She looked embarrassed. Scrap! He grabbed his blanket, covering himself. She looked down, not wanting to look at the larger mech. Yes, it's me, Optimus. Did I wake you? No, I was just trying to fall into stasis, but was having some trouble. What is it that you want? He tensed as she walked over and sat next to him. You know, I've been having trouble falling into stasis as well, she said quietly. He looked at the femme that was now next to him, so beautiful and delicate, yet so strong as a warrior. She was so small, half of him, maybe less. She was so caring and smart. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. You have insomnia? He asked, trying to keep his thoughts away from her beautiful frame. She nodded. Just diagnosed. Was it him, or was RC acting shy? RC, what is it? He asked, worried for the femme. She was never shy, not RC. She did the only thing she could think of. She took him by the neck and kissed him. He was surprised, to say the least, but soon gave in to the kiss, putting an arm around her small waist and pulling her closer while the other took the back of her neck, meaning the kiss. She moaned softly. It had been long, much too long. She parted her lips slightly and ran her glosser lightly over his lips. He parted them and slid his glosser into her mouth. Their tongues twisted together as they each tasted the other. She broke the kiss only because she needed to catch her breath. He did the same, looking at her with confused optics. RC, what are you trying to do? He asked, as he tried his best to cool his heating body. He had always wanted RC for as long as he could remember, but he always thought she didn't want him. Just by a mere kiss, he was aroused, body heating, spark racing, not to mention his cable pressing against his covering. Oh, never mind. She got up quickly, turning to run from the mech. She was stopped by a hand taking her own. He pulled her back to him. I never said I didn't like what just happened, RC. I was just wondering why you were doing this in the first place. I never thought you'd do this, with me especially. Wait, did Ratchet put you up for this? He asked, pulling his hand away from her. No, she said frantically. He did tell me of your attraction to me, but he did not force me to do this. He blushed a bit hearing this. He told you about that? She smiled. Don't worry about it. He smirked a bit, still blushing. Does this mean you feel the same way? It was her turn to blush. Yes, actually, for quite some time, actually. He smirked and touched her now hot cheek. Why didn't you say something? She smiled and leaned into the touch. And what about you, You could have said something at any time. He chuckled. Yes, that's true. But you always seemed independent. I figured you wouldn't want me. She leaned up and kissed him gently. Any femme would be proud to be with you, Optimus. He smiled and took her hand. And any mech you, RC, he said, pulling her close and kissing her. She smiled into the kiss and squeezed his hand lovingly. He pulled her neck upward with his free hand, deepening the kiss. She parted her lips, allowing his glossa into her mouth and playfully wrestling with hers. She let go of his hand as she was pulled on top of him and on the berth. She gave a little yelp as she was turned underneath him, never breaking the kiss. Her hands went along his armorless body until they found their way to his groin covering. He shuddered slightly and broke the kiss. Are you sure you wish to do this, RC? She rolled her optics. Oh, shut up and kiss me, she replied, leaning up and taking his lips again. He kissed her passionately as she unclipped his covering. His already firm cable appeared, and she tossed the covering aside. Her hands now went to the cable, and she placed a hand around it. Optimus moaned and brought his head back at the touch. She smiled and started to pump the cable slowly. Optimus grasped at the sheaths, trying not to moan loudly. She stopped and slipped out from under him. He groaned, a bit aggravated by the sudden stop, but curious what she was up to at the same time. Stood at the edge of the berth, she said, standing. He looked at her curiously, but obeyed. Now, before I do anything else, I want you to know that I just want to please you. I will sleep comfortable knowing that I help you. He looked at her, still confused. All right, then. She smiled and kissed him again. Now open your legs. He obeyed, and she sat between them, placed a hand around his table, and inhaled sharply, holding back yet another moan. She smiled up at him. Be as loud as you want, she said, and started pumping slowly, now wanting to pleasure him too quickly. He couldn't help but moan. Grasping the side of the berth, he closed his optics, throwing his head back and letting the pleasure overtake him. If he didn't have the self-control he did, he would have overloaded when the femme deep-throated what she could of his cable. He moaned lightly, not having the power to control himself. She continued to pleasure him with her mouth, his overload coming rapidly. He groaned, aggravated, when she pulsed away and stood. She laughed. Oh, don't worry, I do believe you'll like this, she said, relieving herself of her armor, including her own groin covering. His optics widened a bit at the sight of the bare femme in front of him. He could have overloaded had he not known what was coming. You don't mind if I ride you, right? She asked as she pushed the mech down onto the berth. No, of course not, he said hastily. He could hardly wait to be inside the beautiful femme now straddling him. She chuckled slightly and lowered herself onto the large mech. He moaned softly, closing his optics. She allowed herself to get used to the size of the cable now inside of her. She started moving up and down at a steady pace. She moaned slightly, the large cable hitting her sensitive wiring like no one else had. He traveled his hands along the side of her frame, feeling her beautiful curves. His overload was approaching rapidly. I can't hold out much longer, he said, having to take a deep inhales to keep from moaning while talking. She leaned over and kissed him, riding him harder now. Come on, Optimus, overload for me, she whispered into his audios. He couldn't take it anymore. He moaned loudly, overloading into the small sim still riding him. He laid his head back, panting. She smiled and slipped off him, laying next to him on the berth. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her close to him. She smiled, looking up at him and laying on her chin on his chest. I'm sorry I couldn't hold on for you. She smiled and leaned up to kiss him. I told you before, Optimus, this was for you, she said, and then yawned, covering her mouth with the back of one hand. Besides, there's always next time, she said, winking and then suckling into him and powering down and going into stasis. He sighed and then smiled, pulling her closer as she rested. Yes, always next time, he said to himself as he powered down and entered stasis. Arcee awoke from stasis, someone's arms around her. She looked up confused, but immediately relaxed, seeing Optimus's face as he was in stasis. She smiled and lay back down. The sun was just rising. That much she could see from the small window in the room. She sighed inwardly. Everyone was going to find out sooner or later, unless of course this was a one-night thing. She was saddened by the thought of this. Chances are that would be what this was. She tried to clear her thoughts of this, but couldn't. All that happened was her getting more and more upset. She was pulled out of his grasp and got up from the berth. He stared in his stasis, but she ignored. She picked up her armor and put it on, trying to be quiet. Arcee? Asked Optimus, awakened from stasis. I'm sorry to wake you, she said, not turning towards him. I'll leave now. He stood, grabbing his drawing covering from the floor and putting it on hastily. You don't have to go. Won't you stay? I have to go. She couldn't hold it in anymore and broke, leaning on the wall with one arm and taking a hold of the desk with the other for support as she sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, she said, trying to compose herself. He took her arms and pulled her to him, hugging her close. Arcee, what is troubling you? Did I hurt you? Did I do something to upset you in any way? I'm sorry, it's nothing. Arcee, if it was nothing, you wouldn't be like this. Wait, forgive me if I'm wrong, but is this because you are afraid of what the others will think? She forced herself to stop sobbing, and she looked up to him. Wait, do you mean this wasn't a one-night thing? His optics went wide at this. No, I mean, unless you wanted it to be. She smiles and hugs him. No, I want this to be more than it was last night. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Optimus Prime. He leans down and kisses the top of her helm. I love you, Arcee, and thank you for what you did last night. Her arms still at his side. She pulls back and looks up to him. Trust me, it was my pleasure. He could feel the energy rush to his cheeks. Well, it was quite enjoyable. She blushes a bit. Well, I should probably go to the washroom and clean up. I have a feeling it's going to be a long day. He chuckles and nods, letting her go to put on his chest armor. She takes his chest plate. Let me, she says, holding it up to put it on his chest. He nods and leans down. She clips the plate into place, running a hand down his chest afterwards. He takes her hand and holds it up to his chest, over the place where his spark rests. You will have always and will always hold a special place in my spark, Arcee, he says, then kisses her softly. She can feel tears in her optics, then she blinks them away. I love you, Optimus, she says, her voice a bit achy. He lets her hand go and straightens out, smiling. Come on, let's go to the washroom, he says, opening the door with one hand and taking her hand back with the other. She nods and follows him. Optimus opens the door to the washroom and then closes it, looking around. It doesn't seem as though anyone is awake yet, he says, still looking around. Is the mighty Optimus Prime scared to get caught with a fin? Arcee laughs and rolls her optics, touching his arm playfully. If we get caught, so what? Then we'll just tell them the truth. They'll find out eventually anyway. Alright, fine, let's go, he says, walking towards the showers. He turns one on and takes a sponge into his hand. Well, come here, he says, taking her arm and pulling her lightly towards him. She looks at him a bit confused. What exactly are you doing? She asks as he wets the sponge. I'm paying you, somewhat, he says with a smile. Would you like to keep your armor on or off? He says, already taking her chest off her chest plating. She smirks. It seems as though I don't have a choice, she says, going to finish taking off her chest plating. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll take care of it all. He takes her arm and gently pushes it away. She smiles and nods as he takes off her chest plating and sets it aside gently. He goes through the rest of the armor as leisurely pace, taking his time to ache in her body. He gets to the last piece and takes off her groin plating, leaving her to her protoform. He steps back and admires her as she blushes. Wow, he finally manages. She looks away, blushing. Oh, shut up. He shakes his head. No, really, Arcee. You're gorgeous. She smiles timidly and looks at him, still blushing. Thank you. He shakes his head and takes the wet sponge. She turns around and he starts washing her back, mothering and massaging. She closes her eyes and sighs happily. He moves down towards her ass and continues to massage. She gives a small yelp of surprise when the sponge runs down her ass to her upper thigh. He chuckles and turns her around, pulling her close. I'm sorry. Did you not want me to touch you there? She smirked and pressed into him, his armored body against her protoform. Oh no, I have no problem with that. He places a hand on her ass and squeezes a bit, making her gasp. She smiles and leans down, kissing her. She wraps her arms around his neck, tiptoeing. He backs her up, making her back hit the wall. She wraps her legs around his waist, holding her onto him for support. He pulls away from her lips, pushing into her more. His cable hard and pressing against its covering. She gasps, leaning her head back against the wall. His lips go onto her neck, his tongue licking every now and then. Oh, Primus, moaned Arcee, shuddering with pleasure. How big's offline? He smiles into her neck and licked lightly. You like that, don't you? She grabbed the back of his neck as if her life depended on it. Oh, Primus, yes, she said, moaning softly. She unlined her optics to look down at Optimus. She gasped and tried to push him away. Optimus! She looked up at her, puzzled. Put me down, she hissed, looking towards the door. Oh, Primus, he said, practically dropping her. He let her down and stepped away. She grabbed him. Don't move, you faggot, my armor is off. Oh my, Primus, he said, standing in front of her to cover her uniform. He then looked back at the mech at the door. He just stood there, optics wide. Bumblebee. And that is where we leave you today. I hope you really enjoyed this interesting start to this fanfiction. It is rated PG-17. I know I forgot to say that in the beginning, but that's what it's rated. Sorry for any of you young folks. I mean, sure, you'll probably find this, but it is not my fault if you get disturbed. Truthfully, I was a little bit disturbed reading it, but I will continue reading it through the end of the fanfiction. But anyway, I will see you guys in the next video, and have a great evening. Bye!
Get nerdy with me. Tell me what game that you get on. Is it card or read? What kind of class do you play, girl? In an RPG.